Masters of the Universe. We all love it. I'm a huge fan of it. And when we think of the people who helped create the line, we often think of people like Roger Sweet, who came up with the name He-Man, or we think of people like Mark Taylor, who did a lot of the original drawings, or even people like Donald Glut, who wrote the original mini-comics and came up with names like Teela and Eternia and Castle Grayskull, which was named after his girlfriend, Linda Gray. Well, there's someone else who had a huge influence on Masters of the Universe, and I'm talking about Jack Kirby. Yes, that Jack Kirby. The Jack Kirby who is responsible for creating basically comic books as we know them. His panel layout, his designs, his character ideas define Marvel Comics, and he went on to do incredible work at DC and on his own in the 70s and 80s. He's mostly known as the creator of comic books like the Fantastic Four, and his work on Avengers and Hulk, and, well, pretty much almost all of the main Marvel characters. I mean, he created Galactus and Silver Surfer. The list goes on and on. In the late 60s, Kirby kind of had enough of Marvel and decided to move his creative engines over to DC Comics. And here, he was the creative vision behind the New Gods, or Fourth World books, as well as one of my personal favorite comic books, Kamandi, The Last Boy on Earth, which, if you haven't read Kamandi, you should really check it out. It's a pretty awesome comic book on his own, and honestly, I think one of Kirby's best works, because it's kind of set outside of the traditional DC universe, and the stories just go on and on and on about a post-apocalyptic world taken over by animals. And, well, anyway, I'm getting off track. Let's go back to talking about the Fourth World, the New Gods, and Jack Kirby's huge influence on the Masters of the Universe line. Now, I'm not the first person to bring this up. This is something that's been talked about in online forums for quite a while, but no one could quite nail down the why. And, well, I'm going to take you back in time because I actually have the why, and I'm probably one of the only people that does. And this came from my work on the Masters of the Universe Classics line and the research I did. All right, so let's talk about Mattel in the 70s. They had some big lines, like Big Jim, an action figure line. It was kind of a male Barbie that could be anything. And then, of course, everyone's original Mattel action figure, Major Matt Mason, which was an astronaut and his companions and aliens from the late 60s. Now, Mattel had looked at the Star Wars license in the mid to late 70s, and honestly, the last time they did space was Major Matt Mason. That was 15 years ago, and the feeling was that space was a fad that was over. So they looked at Star Wars and they passed. They said, not for us. We don't think that this line is going to be a hit. No one's going to want space toys, and movie toys just don't sell. Well, obviously, it was their surprise, but everyone in the world knows that Star Wars was a huge hit, and it went to Kenner, which pretty much defined Kenner as a toy maker. But let's, again, go back to Kirby. So after Star Wars was a huge hit, Mattel was actively looking for something that they could compete with Star Wars. They needed their own male action property. And when I was doing my research for the Masters of the Universe Classics line, besides the stuff I found on Motu, because I was looking in the late 70s, early 80s time frame, what I also uncovered was a huge file filled with Mattel concepts for a Jack Kirby New Gods line. It went all the way to toy designs, to vehicles, to characters, to rollouts. It was really, really extensive. These were plans that Mattel had worked with DC Comics, recognizing that the New Gods were an incredible world to themselves. And it was felt that they would make a perfect action figure line that could compete at market with Kenner's Star Wars line, now that they had passed on it and seen sort of the error of their ways. Now, it's not without a sense of irony that Mattel actually, years later, and quite frankly under my direction, wound up doing quite a few New Gods characters in the DC Universe Classics line, as well as quite a lot of Fourth World characters in the Justice League Unlimited line, too. So it's kind of ironic that after all that time, Mattel did go back to doing Fourth World characters, but the original stab at doing Fourth World was in the late 70s when Mattel extensively fleshed out this comic book into a potential toy line. Now, from my experience at Mattel, I know that things sit around for years, meaning designs that are passed on tend to still sit on desks, they're still all over the walls, and they're still influencing people. Kind of the proof in the pudding is the He-Man Jungle Adventure set. Well, design, basically, when they get an idea that doesn't go forward, they like to kind of push it forward anyway and find ways of getting it done because a lot of work went into things. So the Jungle Adventure set was just recast in purple and made as Snake Mountain. But this is a perfect example of how concepts at Mattel get recycled. I saw this happen all the time, which is why I know that lines like this New Gods proposal were sitting around after the proposal was passed on, and Mattel focused on their own created IP instead. All right, so let's look at some examples here. So when you start going through Kirby's New Gods Fourth World material, well, after this video, you'll never look at it the same again. The characters are not Masters of the Universe characters, but as you look at the designs, you can't help but notice that there are definitely some, well, call it more than subtle design cues that wound up in the Motu line, and specifically the first 2 years of Motu. Obviously, Motu evolved as time went by, but if you really look at the first batch of characters and you compare them concept and art-wise to the New Gods and Fourth World comic book, you will see there is a direct comparison. I mean, for years, fans joked about Zodak being a Metron ripoff. Well, yeah, he kind of was. And it's not just Zodak and Metron. As you really dive into Fourth World comic books, you'll see from the visuals more and more the parallels are pretty uncanny. It's clear that these designs, which had been extensively worked on by the Mattel Design Group for several years, they were still top of mind. They were still all over the office. They were probably pinned to walls. They were, in people's files. And whether consciously or subconsciously, the designs definitely found their way into the original Masters of the Universe line. You can see this with characters, you can see this with good guys, you can see this with bad guys, and the more and more you go into it, the more and more you start to see, wait a minute, yeah, and all that armor and the guns and the way they're designed, it really is, not lifted, but you can see the influence. It's definitely not uncanny. And like I said, it's not just on one figure. You see this across the board. Now, obviously, there were characters that were not influenced by Kirby. I mean, you had He-Man, which was based on kind of Roger Sweet's idea of a barbarian and Mark Taylor's drawings, but they weren't the only two designers to work on the line. And since so many of Mattel's designers had worked on the New Gods proposal, again, those concepts, the way Kirby drew armor and helmets and faces and monsters, you can see the way it just creeped into the designs that was going into building the Masters of the Universe line. Once it was decided that Mattel didn't want to do a licensed line, but instead wanted to move forward with a line they could own that would be their own IP, that could compete against brands like Star Wars that was, dominating the market, you can see that they found influence basically from the past couple years. All of that work. Mattel designers don't like to waste work. Let's just say that. When something doesn't work one year, and I saw this, this isn't just something that obviously happened in the 80s and 70s, but the 10 years I spent at Mattel, I saw this happen all the time, where a design that was created one year that was nixed for one reason or another, almost always got resubmitted the following year in new colors or just slightly tweaked. I'm not saying design is lazy, I'm just saying design was very confident in their concepts and felt that these would be good toys. And honestly, management changed a lot more than design. Designers were the ones who tended to stick around for the long haul. In fact, many of the designers I worked with are still at Mattel, but management completely changed over. Upper management, and how many CEOs has Mattel had in the last 5 years alone? I mean, that's public knowledge. And middle management, the same thing, changed a lot. So it was very easy for designers to take something that might have gotten rejected by one manager a previous year and sort of simply eat that management out, knowing inevitably that management and middle management was going to move on either to a different group or leave Mattel entirely, and they could dig up rejected ideas and represent them. And you can definitely see this in the vehicles for the Motu line as well. Looking at the way vehicles were designed in the Fourth World, I mean, again, it's no coincidence. The line that was proposed to be a toy line with Mattel had vehicles and figures. And especially when you look at the early designs for the Motu vehicles, you can really see that influence from all of the Kirby art. Things like the giant wheels, things like the faces that were incorporated, a lot of animal faces in the designs for the vehicles. You can see that in all of the Kirby art. And again, vehicles were a big part of the pitch too. It wasn't just a figure pitch they were making to DC. They were looking at how they could do a complete play pattern with characters, play sets, and action figures. And essentially all of that energy and momentum went into the creation of Motu once it was decided to pass on doing a New Gods line and instead focus on internal IP on a line that Mattel could own versus a line that they wanted to license. So that's basically it. That's kind of the secret way that Jack Kirby was a huge influencer on the creation of the Masters of the Universe line. His designs for armor, for helmets, for weapons, you can't not see it. And whether it's characters that are literally direct mirrors of each other or original creations, Jack Kirby's the man, and his art had a huge influence on this line that we all love so much. I'm a big Jack Kirby fan, and I'm a big Masters of the Universe fan. And it makes sense why, collectors like myself might be fans of both, because both of them really are linked and have a lot in common. This has been Scott, Toy Guru Neitlich. Thanks for watching. Be sure to share this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the toy aisles.